Yes, this is rather unusual because I wrote an abstract for today's paper, and it's sort of a rookie mistake to dedicate something to paper without returning to the primary subject, which I have since done, and have revisited the picture and materiality of the works, and also revisited my understanding of the sequence of his development, of Ramsay's development. And I have to confess, I am a Ramsay groupie. There might be others here, I guess, but if he's a painter's painter, you can imagine for a painting conservator, it's just this amazing celebration of the act of painting depicted by a beautiful person in a beautifully articulate way, and they're just tremendous things. And now, obviously lots of things have already been covered today, and lots of slides have already been covered, so what I'm going to do is just sort of track through chronologically some of the NGV's very generously acquired or donated works, and you'll see that there's an amazing history of credit lines at the bottom of the images, which I'd like to acknowledge. But I thought I'd just quickly revisit this exquisite work. So, as we've heard already, Ramsay was a very successful and extremely talented student at the National Gallery School under Bernard Hall. And like after he developed through the phases of the drawing classes up to the painting class, he was required to undertake these sort of life studies. And the students were purposely restricted to a limited palette and tonal variation to try and remove the frustrations of colour that would affect young artists. But it's in this mode where Ramsay paints these works which, unlike any other artist that came through, and the very notable artist that came through the National Gallery School, he left the most impressive grouping of pictures as a single person over the whole history of the course of the school, so they're quite remarkable. You see here one of the models. These models would tend to be obviously economically lower class people, and often were immigrants, Italian immigrants and things like that, as well as some of the children. And they're haunting depictions that create an amazing portrayal of the psychology of the person. And it's these works and it's this ability to portray that, I think, which we sort of find at the end of his career as well, or later in his career, in the self-portraits, which I'll get to later on. So I'm just going to quickly go from that to, I don't think we've actually seen this image today, I can't remember. This is anxiety. And it's one of the sort of narrative sort of depictions which artists, or sorry, the students, I should say, would sort of work on. It's very much based on the idea of the influence of Bernard Hall. And of course, it's about dramatic lighting, and it's about working away at a theme. Oh, that's fantastic, thank you. We can't see what's actually going on in the scene, but what actually is happening is there's a bushfire in the top right corner out the window, and the young mother is of course anxious, as we are as viewers, about the outcome. Now, the reason I show the painting, it's almost impossible to show this painting in any meaningful way because of the nature of how it's painted. And so one of the problems with these sorts of works, and I think Alex will probably talk about this more than I will, is that they're comprised on a whole series of sequence of layers, of dark layers, heavily resinous applications, and intermediate layers of varnishes, so that the whole thing becomes very saturated and sort of sweaty and difficult. It means that over time, as these layers deteriorate, light doesn't penetrate well, and you get this diffraction of light at various passes, causing a very problematic way of getting proper access to what was originally quite a readable picture, which is now lost to us. I was going to show some images. I'm not going to now. This is the painting being analysed last week in Melbourne. This is a three-dimensional microscopic system. And it's almost so impossible to show the artwork in any meaningful way that I actually was going to show you three-dimensional forms. And I've got just one, which looks very sciencey. It's kind of sexy, but it's very small. At the very, very top, there's a graph. And that graph is depicting at a very small level, probably about 1 millimetre in width, some of the movement of the paint, because the paint is actually mobile. This is the other component of it. Because some of the inclusions in the paint film never truly dry, they pull and they contract. And the bottom form here is, again, through a microscope. It's actually the eye of the mother who was looking at us. And so even this small section, you can just see this enormous amount of mass of organic material and sort of reflective nature. which is very, very difficult to restore or conserve. And it's unfortunately an inherent problem in these early works. But Ramsay does move away from it. And that's the point of, I guess, what I'll get to today, is that he steps away from somewhat burdened process introduced to him to a much more pure, direct expression, which forms the basis of his art production. And that process comes through freedom from school and a freedom of expression that he achieves largely in his self-portraits. I think one of my points I make at the very end is I think that we've got a lot more work to do to look at that body of work and the importance it did in freeing him up to find his own true hand. One of the other problems about this artwork is that it's got another painting underneath. This is very common, particularly for student works, because they'll recycle canvases. So if I show you the X-ray of the painting here, a little bit hard to see. There's the ghostly figure of the mother's face at the top centre there, but also you might be able to make out... Oh, great. Also you'll be able to make out that there's actually a child here, a child form, whose hand is, and elbow is on the box form here. As we saw in the previous thing, it's one of his typical poses that the students were given, and they'll obviously surround the figure and take various forms. And it's a young boy, that's the head there, which is, it's a shame it's lost to us in some ways. It might be a more successful painting than the one on top, but that's just the, that's just the way things are. So we briefly saw this photo before. This is Hugh Ramsay's studio in Flinders Street. It's up a couple of floors high. It overlooks the Flinders Street station across to the Yarra. It's south-facing, so it's got this wonderful light that sort of flows in from behind where we are now. Ideal for an artist, as opposed to, especially a tonalist artist who wants diffuse light as opposed to the sharp, direct light that would be if you were facing the sun. So very carefully chosen. We see all the components of the prospective studio painter, such as the platform and the seat for the sitter. There's the viewing, the backdrop wall as well, which has got sort of tonal variations in it. And of course we see some of these paintings of the child that we just saw in the X-ray before. But also we see him working on Consolation. So and it's been touched on already, so I don't have to go into great detail, but it's his major undertaking at the start. This is a very large canvas, almost not the largest, but one of the largest ones he worked on, bar about 3. And clearly it was a tremendous ambition of his. And Mary's very beautifully sort of articulated some of the themes of the painting. It's a painting which I was going to talk about initially as being associated very much with this early period and all the problems that I felt I saw in the painting, the darkness in it and the diffraction of light and the sort of lost form and lost definition of tone, I thought was more to do with the burden of the painting and the burden of process and changes over time. But that was actually quite wrong. What I've realised when I actually got the painting out of its frame into the studio and started to look at it properly, because it's not a work that's been on display much in recent memory. It was gifted to us in '66, and prior to that it was at the hospital as well. But it's a painting which has been on display it was on display for the opening of National Gallery of Australia, I think, from memory, NGV at Federation Square, but has since been put back into storage. But when I started to look at it, I realised that what we're actually looking at here is not the painting at all. We're looking at many, many consecutive layers of varnish and dirt, and then more varnish on top, which has trapped the dirt below. And we're seeing through a really discoloured veil, which is unfair, because my perception of the painting is probably other people's perception that it had inherent problems. Here's a UV photo. So ultraviolet light is used by conservators to help reveal some of the surface effects. In this case, this big milky haze across the whole area is a natural resin varnish, which has been applied. The most recent one was applied by restorers, probably at the NGV, and then below that there's other layers, and then below that is some of Ramsay's original layers. So there's all these sequences of layers. But if the paint was cleaned, and this idea of removing the later editions, we would actually see the painting in completely different light. And so one of my responsibilities as a conservator is to be able to mentally make that process go on, so I know what to see, what to expect below. And all I can really do is stand here and say this is actually going to be quite a remarkable painting, and we're going to have an exhibition to show it again, which is great because there's one now flagged. It's going to be a very difficult and complex restoration, but it will transform viewing of the painting. And I've got no way of showing you what the painting should look like without doing the restoration, of course. But as a clue, this detail of the flesh tones, you can probably also see that almost like coffee-coloured sort of undiscrete layers that interfere with the form. And these are actually nothing to do with the actual artwork as well. These are actually on top of the artwork. So if these are all removed, we'll see a much more delicate and beautifully harmonious. And also, what I didn't realise is also a very spontaneous painting. And this is the thing about it. I felt that this was a slow, processed work and very much in keeping with his earlier passages of paint. But now when I look at it, and you can get a sense of it from the beautiful applications in the green foliage, the green material at the top there. It's actually very loosely painted and done with great freedom. It does have inherent problems with cracking, which you'll be able to see as well. But there's a whole another painting there to be found. So we have this depiction here of the artwork in Melbourne, and using a little bit of digital trickery. I know that the height of the painting is, of course, the width there, and we know the final proportions, so we can sort of work out what the approximate size the painting should be. And so, using digital manipulation, we can sort of bring it around and sort of get a basic sort of sense of what it is. Now, there is some inherent distortion in this, but the most important thing for me when I did this is I made an observation I hadn't otherwise noted, which is that the legs come up as opposed to down. So quite a different change in the composition, which is, and I could also talk about the method of painting that's going on there, but I've got to keep moving. But just that very sense of change was interesting. There's also, of course, another photo which we've seen today, which is another rendering of the painting. So now we have three renderings. We've got the early Melbourne one, we've got Paris in his Paris studio 1901, and we have the final composition. So it's sort of like spot the difference. But between these two, there actually are still quite a few changes. We see here that the sky was originally sort of lower, about in line with the nose of the female. And at this point still there isn't the draped garments over the depiction of Saturn. And also, as Mary rightly pointed out, this is a very bushy and quite curly haired figure who, of course, we're being told was George Bell, thank you. There'll be a prize after for that. But what I'm here to tell you is that these are not the same painting. And I'll explain how I can prove that. And I've actually worked this out in the last couple of days, so I'm sorry, it's a little bit sort of in my mind. But this is quite an important issue because I know this canvas is not this canvas, and I'll explain that why. I don't know at what point this canvas was abandoned, but it's not the same one. So potentially it means that there's another canvas somewhere around, or it might have been cut up and recycled, which you might be able to find through X-rays and things like that. But what's really important here is the fact that the artist chose to completely abandon a first depiction and reinvest in Paris a new version. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Here's the X-ray. So the first thing I did was thinking, okay, well, I need to go find the changes. This is before I actually made the conclusion about it's not the same canvas. So I was looking for the crossed legs. I do see, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because it's actually quite a complex X-ray to understand, but you would have gauged from the earlier image that when a void is left by the painter for an area of paint, such as a flesh tone, you get a sense of a void that defines form. So I would very much expect to see through here the crossed legs. I do see the changes such as the skyline that was there, and also see the changes to the bearded feature. It means, of course, what I'm saying, that the bearded person in the final composition is actually a Paris model. It's not the Melbourne depiction at all. So by looking at the X-rays, by looking at microscopic examination, the microscopes, as I said before, it started to become very apparent to me that it's actually not the same canvas at all. And it was only then that I realised something very obvious, which there's actually a bit of factual data on the painting that tells us this, but I've been confused by our collective knowledge that we sometimes have faith in unnecessarily. So here we see the back of the canvas, we see the artist's address at the top, and we see two Cullinan stamps. There's one on the canvas and one on the stretcher. So the one on the actual canvas is Parisian, and the one below is from Dean's art in Melbourne. Now, we know it was very common for Dean, who sold the canvases to the Melbourne students, it's very common for them to actually buy international canvases, such as Winsor & Newton, and then stamp their name on them, and they sort of badge them effectively. And so we've always just believed that this canvas was the Melbourne canvas and that it had been badged by Dean's art. But doing a lot more research, I've realised that there's actually no way that that it is the same one. And one of the things clues that gave it to me is that the canvas, and this is slightly it's a little bit difficult, this concept. The canvas has been stretched twice, which is why there are spare sets of holes, as opposed to the ones that are holding it here. But the stretcher's only ever been used once, so there's no extra holes underneath. And so the stretcher and the canvas have no association at all. The stretcher was probably put on in Melbourne after Ramsay returned back to Melbourne. He might have rolled the painting, I don't know, I can't quite tell. Or it just might have been a very simple stretcher he had in Paris, and so he's bought a more robust one. There's actually no way of knowing. The other thing I noticed is that there's these tiny little marks here, which are just, they're so small. You have to look very closely to these sorts of details. But you find enough of them around the outside of the edge of the canvas to understand that what he's doing is actually gridding up the little marks that help space what would become the grid lines to transfer the image from one canvas to another. We have a Cullinan database, which is a fantastic thing. So on our website at the Conservation Department, we have a listing as much as possible of all the canvas stamps on our artworks. And this is actually what slightly confused me for a while, because Consolation is here, and we've listed them as a dual thing, thinking that there was a Melbourne canvas. But in actual fact, the Fonnet is listed a couple of times, there's a couple of variations, and there's a lot of Australian artists that use those canvases, but none of them were actually in Melbourne. This canvas was actually never sold in Melbourne by a commercial seller. So it was obviously a Paris-bought canvas and a rebirth of the composition. And then, of course, you start to realise that all his canvases in Paris, which do have canvas stamps, are from the same supplier. So it all makes perfect sense. Not only did they supply canvases, they also supplied brushes, including to Whistler. This is, these very long, standard, beautiful ones, what Whistler's commissioned both in 1899 and 1902. So right around the time Ramsay's there himself, buying brushes and canvases. And you can see these long, extended ones in his hands. And they are wonderful because they are what provided the freedom of, as opposed to working up close, these little, tiny little brushes sort of flicking away. It provides the opportunity for the artist to stand back and keep distance and work in a very vivid and extended hand. And that's why we see this incredible expressive work in the artist here. And also the brushes can be seen. Oh, sorry, I was just going to briefly make the point that these are very, very complex constructions. These are not by any means happenings that just sort of occur out of convenience. These are large commitments of financial time and financial material money into these large-size canvases. You can see it's a full-size canvas there on the stretcher. And they're very carefully and deliberately worked out. And I think that we need to reassess these group of works, because collectively they allowed the freedom, and you can see the amazing freedom and speed of application that made him break his reign from Bernard Hall. I'm sort of bagging Bernard Hall now, it's not really fair. It was the mode of teaching that was existing in Melbourne at the time. Also remember that that there was no history of self-portraiture in the National Gallery in Victoria. Like, there was no paintings on displays on the walls. Whereas when he came to, it's very hard to see, but just quickly, there's the long brushes there. When he came to Paris, of course, we've heard about his walking through the galleries, seeing and studying and being through the Louvre with Lambert, thinking about the history of artists and the history of things. I'm just going to show just quickly as a finishing moment some of the artists that were on display were acquired prior to his arrival. Self-portraits, Delacroix, David, Chardin. Of course, we've heard about Watteau and the beautiful Watteau in white dresses. So I'm not saying this is the reference to the artwork, but they're interesting sort of comparisons, and I'll finish here. But I think we need to really go back and rethink about Consolation. It's a Parisian subject. He's gone back and started again, and it's his largest canvas painted in Paris. I think once it's restored, we should go back and look at what it really intended to be. Thank you.